experiences through his writing that kind of change what is real and what's not real, what's history, what's alive. Um, so I'm going to read from Manuel's bio and then a short description of a course they're leading on Sylvia Winter, and then throw the mic over to Manuel. As far as the course of the event goes, when we want to have something kind of more open than just a one directional lecture. So when people are moved to participate or have questions or reactions, if you will say hi in the chat and and unmute and join the conversation, then we'd like to all be together through this. Yeah, so here's the bio. Raised in the Bronx, Manuel Arturo Abreu is a Dominican non-disciplinary artist working with what is at hand in a process of magical thinking with attention to ritual aspects of aesthetics. They have lived and worked in Portland, Oregon since 2009. With Victoria Ann Reese, they co-founded and co-run Homeschool, a free pop-up art school in Portland and online, and it's in its 6th year of genre non-conforming edutainment curriculum. Manuel has like a distinct gift for bringing people together through their research and commitment to thought and experiments. For the Sylvia Winter class, Manuel describes her as the most important living Caribbean philosopher, and the course will be 10 sessions long with a sliding scale cost, and we'll meet every other week on Zoom, every 2 weeks. They'll look at Sylvia Winter's poetry, theater, fiction, and particularly her philosophy work. Winter proposes that the human, as we have been disciplined to think of it, is simply the overrepresentation of the white European male as the human. And as we've also been disciplined to believe that all causes are solely physical or material, we sometimes fail to see the constructedness of these concepts, nature and the human. Winter calls this the mechanization of the world. And I think this goes really well with thinking about ecology and nature, not only in terms of like a beautiful landscape, but as far as like which direction and animacy or animation goes, whether, yeah, I'm gonna thank you all again one more time for being here. And Manuel, if you're ready to share the slideshow and begin the lecture, let's go there.
Great. Thank you so much, Isaiah and Amal, for organizing this. It's good to see some familiar faces who took the Wilson Harris course in the chat, as well as some new faces. Wilson Harris was a Guyanese writer. He's my favorite writer and has had a transformative influence on me. So I'm always overjoyed to get the opportunity to present his work. So yeah, thanks to everyone that's put this together. Thanks to the interpreters and the staff that's the backbone of this event. It's giving me the privilege to present this work. So this is called The Art of Wilson Harris as Toolkit Against Colonial Ecologies. This is Wilson Harris. You see here a black and white photo of a brown-skinned man with wavy hair and a mustache in a blazer and turtleneck. Photo was taken in 1954 in London, and the author, Wilson Harris, is portrayed from a 45-degree portrait angle. I'm going to do my best to have brief image descriptions every time one comes up, so hopefully that's useful. So, who is Wilson Harris? He is, for me, Guyana's greatest novelist. Developed an abstract, epic narrative style, which he called quantum fiction, based on 20 years as a land surveyor in the Guyanese jungle interior. So, land surveying is a colonial and capitalist tool of measuring and parceling out uh, previously uh, diagrammed, unparceled land. So it's part of the process of turning land into a dead resource for the colonizer, the plantation owner, the enslaver, the mercantilist, the capitalist. And Wilson Harris spent 20 years doing this work, and his time in the interior really transformed him. He ended up rejecting most of the standard models that are available in the Caribbean. So things like protest realism, socialist realism. For him, realism could not measure up to reality. And so the artist and writer must find new modalities of sensing and feeling. And these new modalities are, in fact, ancient potentials and nonlinear temporalities, which Harris says lay buried in the arts of the Caribbean imagination. I'm going to talk a bit about his time in the interior and the impact that the landscape and the Afro-Indigenous and Amerindigenous folks that he met, both co-workers and also people on the lands, and the impact of all of this, specifically the landscape. And then I'm going to talk a bit about how his narrative style and critical approach can help us reject colonial frameworks of land as dead resource, the overrepresentation of the white European male as the human, the dehumanization and desacralization, like secularization of African and indigenous cosmologies. Harris says the impact of the landscape and riverscape and the rainforest was far-reaching and momentous. I knew I needed to find a different series of equations between the language of the imagination and the complex rhythms of life, rhythms and life of the landscape. And it was to take several discarded novels before I knew I'd got there in Palace. So today we had offered Palace of the Peacock for people who were interested in reading from Harris's first novel, which contains the seeds of all his future work. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. So I've got a video here of Harris traveling in England, in Chelmsford and London, and speaking a bit. It gives us a sense of his approach, his voice, his singular voice. And so in this video, we see images of a brown-skinned man with a mustache and a blazer and button-up white shirt and tie, moving throughout the city of London, as well as the suburb of Chelmsford, first by train, then by car. And then it cuts also to talking headshots of this author speaking about nature and voyage and mystery. We also see him walking through a park, looking at a bronze statue of a rotund, bald white man. So I'm going to play this clip briefly so we can get a sense of his voice, and then I'll continue with my lecture.
I led many expeditions into the heartland of the Guyanas. And one of the things that struck me was that many members of the crew were oblivious of the great voyages that had occurred, that had, in a sense, deposited them in the Americas. The voyage has immense value because the voyage has within it something I would say that is divine. The voyage is always an exploration. It's a seeking. It's a searching. It's a quest for value. Now that quest may be overlaid by all sorts of matters to do with greed and lust and violence. But under that, that value remains. Legbo is really an African god. But one notes that he has a lame leg. So he's vulnerable. On the other hand, he's a god. He's divine. Now, this is nothing new. One sees it with the Christian faith. Christ, the crucified Christ, is vulnerable, yet the Son of God. So we have Legbo, vulnerable, yet divine. And on top of that, Kofi, who is the rebel, the black rebel who fought in South America. That complex of forces is obviously a complex that is explosive. We have come to a very serious time in our history in which we have to ask ourselves whether the direction we are pursuing is wrong, whether the sails we have put up, under which we move, are oriented to the wrong trend, the wrong wind, the wrong tide, whether we have to turn and go in a different direction, completely different direction. The questions we have to ask ourselves about nature. Nature ails. If one looks, for example, at the fantastic films of outer space, which are simulated, what do you see? You see meteors striking planets, gouging out great bits of planets, causing explosions as if those planets are vomiting, they're ill. There is an ailment running through nature, and we have to see that all of us, in some degree, have caught the virus.
So this is a clip from Colin Nutley's film, which attempts to render in cinema Harris's 1971 novel, Silva da Silva, / The Genesis of the Clowns. And in this novel, as Harris speaks about a bit, he kind of contrasts the selfish, entitled artist who is like a bloodsucker on his muses with this rebellious, explosive force embodied by a wounded divinity. So we've got Elegba, right? Eshua Legbara or Elegua or Papa Legba, who in his journey across the Atlantic goes from a kind of virile, young, masculine force to a older, older person with a limp who walks with a cane. And so the journey has aged him. But in this wound, in this vulnerability, it's actually embodying his great power as omniglot, as keeper of the gate between the material and immaterial. And so in the novel, Harris himself is a character. So that's why these clips exist. Nutley tries to render this metafictional gesture by interviewing Harris himself, which is wonderful because as far as I know, this is the only video that exists of Harris speaking. There are audio clips from seminars, but this is the only like talking head shot. So I value it greatly. And yeah, so the complex of forces in the novel contrasted with the selfish artist, Da Silva, who's like a Portuguese and African mixed man, who's a painter. The complex of forces is Legba, as well as Coffee, who led a rebellion on the Berbice coast of Guyana. He was, I believe, a con man who, yeah, led a wonderful rebellion in the 17th century when the Dutch ruled the coast of Guyana. And so Legba and Coffee both have a limp, and this limp embodies their power. Actually, it's part of their explosive power. Okay, I'm going to continue with my lecture. Oh no. So what's Guyana? How is Guyana Caribbean? Well, it's Caribbean because it's part of the coastal Caribbean complex, as we see here. Guyana is in the bottom right. So in one sense, it's the end of the Caribbean. In another sense, it's kind of the beginning. It's where Amazonian people at the Orinoco Delta, who spoke Arawak and Carib languages, first originated and took voyages into the Caribbean to people these islands. But yeah, so Guyana is an Anglophone Caribbean country, first colonized by the Dutch, then the British. The population is 784,000, according to the 2016 census. Guyana achieved independence on the 26th of May in 1966 and became a republic in 1970. It's got a socialist bent to its politics, so that's been changing recently. It's become influenced by the kind of neoliberal wave that has taken over this hemisphere. Present indigenous tribes in the region are the Waiwai, Makuhi, Patamona, Lokono, Kalinya or Carib, Wapishana, Pemon, Akawayo, and Warao. And the mixed population that isn't part of indigenous tribes is a mix of Amerindian, African, European, Indian, and East Asian aspects. So here's a map of the Caribbean. To me, all of these places on the coast, the northern coast of South America, are part of the Caribbean, just in the same sense that the Yucatan is part of the Caribbean, and coastal Honduras and Nicaragua. So there needs to be a shift. We need to start understanding that there is an idea of mainland Caribbean as well as island Caribbean. So yeah, let's talk about nature. Harris said, "I'm intent on repudiating a dumbness or passivity with which we subconsciously or unconsciously robe the living world. The rainforest made an enormous impact on me. I learned that one should not attempt to, indeed, one cannot colonize the unconscious. There is a link between being and what one calls non-being, and it may be possible that one's prayers for God could be answered through inhumans who appear to be mute and whose gestures bring an answer to that prayer. In fact, their mute bodies must be read by us in concert with all sorts of engravings upon rocks, other surfaces. When I come upon a felled tree in a park in England, it sometimes shapes itself in my inner eye as the epitaph of a murdered forest in Brazil or Guyana or Venezuela." So here we see a shot of Guyana's interior. The interior region has an Amazonian ecological aspect, so it's a tropical rainforest. In this image, we see lush green mountains covered in tropical trees. And I'll have other images of the interior throughout for us to get a sense of where Harris spent 20 years of his life. So I want to talk a bit as well about his biography. Isaiah mentioned in the description of the event that Harris's stepfather was also a surveyor. He was lost in the interior of Guyana. No one ever knows what happened to him. Presumably he died. And his stepfather is an important figure because when he died, um, Harris's biological mother mourned both the death of her stepfather, of her second husband, and her first husband, which was Harris's biological father, who died of a heart attack. And she brought out this big trunk, which was Harris's first exposure to literature. So I'm going to read a quote from this biographical article that Harris wrote with Hennemees Jelinek, a Belgian critic of his work. There was a large black trunk in my mother's bedroom, which she opened for the first time in my presence on the day the news came that my stepfather had disappeared, presumed drowned in the rivers and rainforests of Guyana. The year was 1929. I was 8 years old. My stepfather's death or disappearance was the second crucial bereavement my mother suffered in 6 years. My biological father had died suddenly in 1923, and my memories of him were therefore quite naturally void or hollow, though on seeing the contents of the large open trunk, he, the biological father, seemed strangely alive in my aroused imagination because of books of his that my mother held up, and a photograph to which she pointed, in which he stood between two companions, and a horse carven from a greenheart tree. A subconscious thread or connection was woven then with the South American heartland of the Guyanas, into which I was to lead many survey expeditions as a young man. The impact of the forests and savannas on those expeditions was to become of profound value in the language of the fictions I later wrote. My stepfather's disappearance in that immense interior when I was a child was the beginning of an involvement with the enigma of quests and journeys through visible into invisible worlds that had become themselves slowly visible to require further penetration into other visible worlds without end or finality. So here we get this kind of biographical moment, which enshrines Harris's, I guess, transformation from a scientist and surveyor into a writer, right? And this theme of the double death is very common in his work, as we see at the beginning of Palace of the Peacock, where the main character, the kind of conquistador figure Dunn, dies multiple times within the first couple sentences. He's both shot by Mariella, the indigenous woman that he used to date and abuse and who ran away from him. She shoots him, but he's also hung by some sort of mystic or divine executioner or judge. And so in the beginning of Palace, we have a double death that presumably relates to this biographical component of Harris's entry into literature. Here's another shot of the Guyanese interior. Here we see a river. I think this is the Essequibo River, and we've got 5 different waterways that are being, yeah, 4 different waterways depicted here, intersecting in a kind of star pattern. And again, the land is lush and covered in green tropical trees. The land shown here is kind of in a triangular formation, 5 different or 4 different triangular formations that align with the waterways of the river. So Harris argued we need a new mythopoetic vision, not grounded in linear dead time, but in sacred dream time, which is circular, fractal, and deep in a kind of genealogical sense, extending way back before the human. And for him, this mythopoetic approach more accurately reflects reality. He says, in Carnival, I was an unfashionable writer from the future. I belonged, yet did not belong. I was realitist of reality, rather than realist of realism. There is no ground of alternatives but to recover the dangerous chasm, the forbidden ascent, and seek a new dimension of feeling, a new oath of humanity, he says in the epigraph to his book, Ascent to Omai. And he called this style quantum fiction. This is interesting because quantum or quantization directly relates to the measurement work of the surveyor. The main thing that a surveyor does is take meticulous measurements. So hydrographic measurements, hydraulic measurements, cadastral or estate measurements, who owns what, where the boundaries are of the estate. That's cadastral surveying. And so this process of measurement, as well as the social environment with the crew and people on the land and the land itself as a living being, developed for him this idea of quantum fiction. He says, my writing is quantum writing. Do you know of the quantum bullet? When it's fired, it leaves not one hole, but two. And so we can think later together about this idea of observer-dependent environments and the act of measurement as it impacts, existence itself, right? Observation impacts, there are things don't exist before they're measured, basically, and this is one of the principles of quantum mechanics. Or not don't exist, but exist only in kind of clouds of probability, where two things can be true at the same time, right? Like Schrodinger's cat. And only when we do the measurement or impact the environment in a certain way do we get a final kind of decided ontological status. So for example, we have to look into the box to know if the cat is dead or alive. And before we do that, it's technically in both states. So he's interested in this both state moment, right? And how the act of measurement or the act of writing, which is a kind of transcription of phenomena itself, how that can impact our own worldview. The radical openness of language is the medium for this quantum flux. He says, in describing the world you see, the language evolves and begins to encompass realities that are not visible. And for Harris, a philosophy of history may well lie buried in the arts of the Caribbean imagination. This philosophy is not autonomous or abstract, but in line with Paget Henry's concept of Caribbean philosophy, enmeshed and intertextually embedded in Caribbean forms of life. So it's distinct from Western philosophy. It's deeply embedded in the social and the political. Here's the cover of the first edition of The Infinite Rehearsal, which is an abstract painting depicting a fisher. The fisher's head is composed of two triangles. The body is composed of various kind of oblong shapes. At the bottom is a kind of swatch of green watercolor, under blue watercolor, and then under the green is a line of yellow watercolor. And this is meant to depict the land and the water and whatever is under the land. The fisher's line seems to have caught this blob, which has a fingerprint shaped red watercolor blotch, which is a circle. And then there are some crosses and triangles on this entity that the fisher's line is caught on. There's also a boat elsewhere in the water, which is depicted in this kind of abstract way. Right above the fisher is a circle, which depicts the sun. And next to the circle, there's some more swatches of watercolor and a kind of like ochre or yellow. And then on top of that, kind of cornflower. So yeah, this is a really pretty cover. I just like it. So Harris said, and this is kind of more of a description that he gave in an interview about his writing style. He said, I believe that the images of a character and action are always refracted in the minds of people. A certain refraction or distortion occurs, and this signifies for me that the artist or writer does not really possess the subjective purity that one imagines she possesses. It seems to me that his vision is fashioned by all sorts of things, small things that happen to her, perhaps the kind of food she eats, the kind of landscape which she remembers, and the kind of landscape in which she lives. I mean, things that have to do with her emotional life in all sorts of circumstances, curious prejudices, various things. I mean, we have to go very deep back into the ancestral past, and therefore there is, it seems to me, a certain impurity in the artist's vision, and I therefore have striven all the time to make character, landscape, and myth agents of each other, possibly involuntary agents of each other, because I don't believe in the self-sufficiency of the artist. I don't believe in self-sufficient models. I think the self-sufficient model is an illusion, and I know that the fashionable novel, the realist novel, does incline toward this self-sufficiency because it is easy to read something where one finds oneself quickly in a facile way but it seems to me that life is not like this. This refraction occurs, this distortion occurs, and one has to somehow find a way of doing this in a novel. And I think that while it has one disadvantage, this approach, in that it makes for difficulty, the quantum fiction approach, it has an enormous advantage in that it encourages what I would call the open mind, where one knows that what is happening is not dogmatic, is not final, is not total. So new possibilities can emerge, new things can happen. Here's another image of the interior of Guyana. This is a savanna. In the back, we see a large hill covered in verdant trees. And then the majority of the image is a savanna where the farther parts are striated between greener and browner parts of short grass, as well as some trees dotting that landscape. And then in the foreground, we've got a fairly dry portion of the grass with more trees, as well as people on horseback. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 people on horseback. So there's 6 horses and actually 7 people. There's one horse that has 2 people on it. And they're, I guess, riding through the savannah toward the big hill in the back of the image. So here's a wonderful depiction of the kind of connections that come from this quantum fiction approach or this open-minded approach. The table comes from a tree in the forest. The forest is the lungs of the globe, and the lungs of the globe breathe on the stars. There's all sorts of connections, and those are quantum connections. Quantum mechanics and physics would embrace these connections. At that stage, he's talking about when he wrote Palace of the Peacock, I had read nothing of quantum mechanics, and I simply addressed my repudiation of the absolute chains upon nature, my repudiation or rejection of a nature there to serve me, to prop up my structures, as an intuitive, disturbing necessity. I needed to immerse myself in the living, disturbing, but immensely rich text of landscapes and riverscapes and skyscapes. So through this immersion, language began to break its contract with mere tools framed to enshrine a progressive deprivation. There was a more complex and intuitive approach to language in which one suffers and through which one perceives the peculiar ecstasies of dimensionality. From his great talk, The Fabric of the Imagination. T.J. Cribb analyzes Harris as follows. Although Wilson Harris subjects traditional systems of perception to a radical epistemological mutation, it does not ignore or deny the traditions, but rather incorporates, revises, and transcends them. The compelling coordinates of time and place that inform the realist novel are still there, and we know that's true because Harris has things like characters and plots and places and feelings in his work, human feelings. But the reader is forced to locate the same events simultaneously on quite different scales of perception and value, hence the strenuousness or difficulty of reading Harris, but hence too a sense of liberation that grows with every reading. Events are freed from fixed bearings within a single culture and tradition. It is thus perfectly correct, well, I don't know if that's true, to treat Wilson Harris's writing as exceptional and revolutionary, a James Joyce of the rainforest. Here we see another savanna in the Guyanese interior, and in the background is a large flat cliff with a border of fog at the base of the cliff. The savanna itself is fairly green, and there are some bushes that kind of lead to the cliff. The base of the cliff is green. The flat top of, or the plateau of the cliff is brown, and then there's a clear sky, not a clear sky, sorry, a blue sky in the background with some clouds. I don't know what these clouds are called, sorry. I also have some images in this slideshow of visual artists engaging with Wilson Harris. Stanley Greaves is a Guyanese painter who for 50 years engaged Wilson Harris's visionary fiction through painting. So here we've got Artist and the Mother of Space from this series, Dialogue with Wilson Harris, which is from 1964 to 2014. And in this picture, we see a dark-skinned figure holding a paintbrush with the palette next. next to them, next to the paintbrush. And then the painter is looking at a kind of cosmic landscape, which has colors of black, purple, beige, blue, and brownish, reddish. That space landscape has various shapes, including a shape that looks like a human face in the middle of it, and it's got white points, which are indicative of stars or other aspects of the cosmos. Some of the points are blurrier, and some of them are very well defined. The ones in the left field on this kind of beige pattern are very well defined, and then the ones on the right with the black and purple and blue are blurrier. They kind of look like they're moving almost. So Harris's work emphasizes cross-cultural, syncretic, and creolized manifestations of Caribbean survivance. So speaking on Haitian Vodun as an example, he argues that it breaks the tribal monolith of the past and reassembles an intertribal or cross-cultural community of families or nations, to use the term that the religions use, nation, division, and to invoke at the same time a curious psychic reassembly of the parts of the dead god or gods, and that reassembly is issued from a state of cramp to articulate a new growth. Harris's prose is densely abstract and steeped in the Caribbean imagination in the language of fables, music, landscape, porch, church, etc. However, some argue that it has more in common with South American magical realism than Caribbean aesthetics. I disagree with this. Harris was pretty clear about his method's basis in Caribbean myth and cross-culturality. And unlike magical realism, he doesn't consign myth to fable and plot. Like, it's not just weird stuff that randomly happens. It's rather infused within the language. It makes the language abstract and ineffable. Here we see Harris in Guyana in the early 1950s on the far left. In this image are three men. The one in the middle is crouched, wearing a white shirt and dark slacks and dark shoes, wearing a construction hat. All three men are brown-skinned. The two that flank the one in the middle are not crouched. They're standing up and shirtless. Wilson Harris has white slacks, and the man on the right has dark slacks and white shoes. Wilson Harris is leaning with his left arm on the crouching man, and the man on the right has a shotgun in his hand. He was presumably the watchman of the expedition. And then they're all in front of one of these shacks that they would build to live in during the expeditions. So they would have it as a base and then go farther into the interior, come back and sleep there after their journey. And the shack is made of wood. It's got wooden stairs and a porch that's surrounded by horizontal wooden slats, kind of a wooden fence. And the ground is dirt. He said in the clip that we watched, the voyage has immense value because the voyage has within it something that is divine. It's a searching, a quest for value. And the voyage, therefore, has to be reclaimed from conquest, colonization, linear time, etc. And we can assume, and Harris says as much, that fiction itself is part of the toolkit for this reclamation of the voyage. He says, fiction possesses a revisionary capacity itself, as if the text possesses an intentionality of its own to uncover connections that lie in other and deeper layers of what appears to be lost, areas that can be recovered to assist us in reading reality in a new way that is also unfathomably alive to ancient perspectives and resources within the cross-cultural body or bodies of many civilizations whose past, whose traceries, whose elements, whose curious voices and so on and so forth are susceptible, or through which we are susceptible to and beyond our finite predicament. Here we've got a black and white silk screen that says migration is an act of courage. This is an image in support of undocumented migrants. And it depicts on an uneven surface, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. It looks like there's a parent and the child in front of them, a parent with a child on their back, an older person in front of that parent, and then a child at the very front. And the child at the front is extending their hand to release a large number of butterflies, which travel in an S shape out of the square of the composition. The composition is framed in a linear square. Paget Henry argues that for Harris, consciousness is a universal living medium whose activities are necessary for the emergence and sustenance of all life forms. Harris says, when I speak of the unconscious, I am not only speaking of the human unconscious, but of the unconscious that resides in objects, in trees, and in rivers. I am suggesting that there is a psyche, a mysterious entity that links us to the unconscious in nature. And so Harris's focus on the unconscious of landscape and human works against the danger of falling into the trap of intellectualizing issues which lie so much deeper. So part of the rejection of realism is also the rejection of this rationalist, materialist framework that doesn't allow for immaterial or spiritual causes, or for a kind of perspective on nature itself as a living consciousness, as an agent that transforms us in the same way we transform it. Here's another artist's engagement with Harris's work. Here we've got Mathieu Clayob-Abonanc's work. This is an installation view of his show at the Rochechouart Museum in France. It's a kind of castle in France. And the show was called Palace of the Peacock. Here we see a room with a wooden floor and two wide brick beams, which support a kind of wooden latticed roof. And in the installation shot at the very front, we've got a wall made of peacock feathers. And so this is a direct reference to many images in Palace of the Peacock, which talk about people watching from the leaves and from the bush. And then when the surveyors go to check, there's nobody there. In the back, we see a red painting on the second brick column. And then in front of that is a floor sculpture on a white napkin. So I look at that sculpture in the next image, which is called A Morsel of Flesh, Stripped from the Bones of the Invaders. On the wood floor is the cloth folded in a square, and on top of the square cloth is a piece of wood shaped like a femur bone with 3 holes drilled onto the lengthwise surface, and then mouth holes at both ends of the wooden structure. And so here, Abonanc is referring to the Carib bone flute, which is a central image or concept in Harris's work, in which he's referencing this Carib ritual of consuming a morsel of flesh from prisoners of war and rendering the flute out of the femur of the consumed prisoner, and then bringing it up to their lips in this ritual and silently playing the flute, or not playing it, however you want to interpret it. So Henry argues that there are 2 Central Caribbean aesthetic tendencies. On the one hand, historicism. This is embodied by rationalists like C.L.R. James, his student Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, El Segovia, etc. And on the other hand, mythopoeticism, embodied by people like Wilson Harris, Derek Walcott, Jamaica Kincaid, Erna Broadburg, etc. There are also synthetic approaches which mesh the historic and the mythopoetic, and Sylvia Wynter would be a great example. I argue actually that Harris is another great example because we have to remember that he started as a scientist and that was part of what influenced his transition into literature and theory. For Harris, historicism is like realism. It doesn't provide tools to break out of the colonial regime of thinking, where nature is a dead resource to be conquered by the living agent man. Rather, Harris says that we must turn to the nonlinear and mythic strategies which allowed and allow Caribbean people to survive the first phases of the colonial. So attention to syncretic religion, marriage, guerrilla ethnobotany, and other formations in the Caribbean and Afro-diasporic past reveal the necessary spiritual drive and focus, which in this crucial moment, as he says, will lead us toward liberation. So here's a quote where he says, "It is not that the Caribbean and Guyanas are at the rim of the world like a kind of gutted monster, as anti-Black V.S. Naipaul and others see it, but rather I would suggest that the waves of action stemming from many movements and continents since the European Renaissance have come so thick and fast that realism becomes in itself a dead end, and the need begins to dawn for a drama of consciousness which reads back through the shock of place and time for omens of capacity, thresholds of capacity that were latent, unrealized within the clash of cultures and movements of peoples into the South Americas and the West Indies. Such an art of subsistence of memory involves, I feel, a kind of shroud at times or organ of obscurity. And here people have linked his thinking to Glissant's opacity, of course. We need to participate as intrinsic to the arousal of illumination in perspectives of sleeping / awakening resources of the imagination. Another beautiful painting by Stanley Greaves. Here he's depicting an image from Carnival, Harris's 1985 book. The painting is called Aunt Alice and Masters, Almshouse Gate from 2013. So on the left, we've got a Black figure with kind of a chalky white outline, or not outline, shading inside the Black frame. And the figure is holding a kind of golden chalice, as if seeming to strike or about to strike, presumably white, light-skinned, presumably Portuguese or Dutch descent person with a white hat, cream shirt, long white sleeves, long white skirt, and brown boots. This person is holding a flower with the stem pointing upwards and the flower itself pointing downwards. The flower itself looks like a kind of flame. Above both figures is a cloth which blows in the wind, and the cloth features a shadow figure with a big petticoat skirt and tied up hair, like a ponytail flowing in the wind. In the background of the image are like slats of wood and a kind of like gate figure in the top left, which is drawn in a very simplified way that looks like an H. The white or light skinned figure on the right is kind of trapped or hiding behind gates, like the gates presumably of the almshouse in the book. And so the gate is depicted with vertical black lines, and there are 4 of those. Another one from Greaves, this is called Abbery Survey Paytable from Genesis of the Clowns. And here he's basically depicting this kind of brutal low-wage work that Harris writes about in the book by people working the land. This painting is sort of hard to describe. There are 3 black hands extending from the left part of the canvas and 1 hand which is kind of blue-black. They're extending toward a grid, kind of Piet Mondrian style grid of lines, which create rectangles or squares. And some of the squares are gray circles with the symbol for cent inside of them. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those. On the right of the image is a kind of red and black checkerboard. In the black squares of this checkerboard are negative numbers, the negative odd numbers. So negative 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. On the bottom of the image, to the left, there is a kind of gradient of different colors. We've got black, light green, brown, purple, beige, red, blue, and black. And then on the right of that, a kind of wood texture. And the wood texture has these abstract shapes composed of rectangles and circles. Finally, on top of the image, above the kind of white area where the hands are reaching toward the grid, there's what looks like a stylized uneven landscape with 3 flags, 2 blue flags on either end, and then a red flag in the middle. Finally, at the far end of that uneven landscape is a stylized hut, which is depicted in, again, a very simplified way with a black roof, and then 2 lines depicting the shape of the hut. And so Greaves offers this quote from Harris's work, which illuminates what he's depicting here. In Genesis of the Clowns, Harris writes, "The average wage in the abbey was $2 per day. 6 years earlier at Bardica, it was $1.25, or 5 shillings per day." So Harris says, "It is necessary to find reserves, connections, links that run much deeper than the political situation as it appears, in which you have these people simply confronting each other, one side protesting, the other side declaring its innocence, one side declaring that it is the oppressor, the other side living totally within a formula of the oppressed, in which the very language of the oppressed becomes so conditioned by the notion of being oppressed that it becomes a kind of self-righteous deprivation. So that is to say, by simply recycling modes of realism, protest, rational materialism, historicism, etc., the Caribbean freedom seeker neglects the power of the radical imagination, the inquisitive voyage under the surface of these easy dichotomies of like noble savage and evil colonizer, and ends up, by using historicism, ends up reproducing the same oppressive regimes that we're seeking to escape. So, for example, if we take this like very simple binary as the truth, we would not be able to talk at all about things like Carib jungle police, right? Caribs signing contracts with the British to avoid themselves being colonized, signing contracts with the British to hunt other indigenous people in the interior of Guyana. We wouldn't be able to talk about the political complexities and unrealized capacities in the clash of cultures, as Harris said, if we're kind of stuck with this rationalist, simplistic framework. So if one pursues that to the logical next step, then the text itself, like nature, becomes a living consciousness, and the author becomes but one facet of its life movements. So this is a kind of post-colonial death of the author, but it's a death which causes revival. So a mutuality emerges where text or nature actually ends up writing the author or the measurer. And speaking of the 1985 novel Carnival, Harris says, "My intuitive sensation is that though I am, in cold logic, the author of the book, other nameless hands wrote through or in me, imbued with different dimensionalities, different timescales, to overturn linear complacency and create self-reversible mutualities between author and living text. This feeling may seem strange in an egocentric and authoritarian age, but it is true, I think, to the ancient life of the imagination, ancient genesis of the imagination that remains a paradox and ceaselessly unfinished. True also of the cyclical rhythms of language that vary and evolve within a medium of embodiments, curvatures, displacements of space. True in a sense to what is beyond language, even as we glimpse in that mystery of beyondness a revisionary key to a prison house of expectations and conflicts within the hard-hearted frames of cultures and civilizations. That key is, I believe, the extraordinary specter an imaginative writer may pursue in concert with intuitive guides and guidelines that are subtle, sometimes unspectacular, but apparently indestructible in their penetration of surfaces of existence that we take for granted." Here's the cover of Palace of the Peacock. I believe this is the second edition cover from Faber. So Charles Monteith and T.S. Eliot basically discovered Harris's writing and got him signed to Faber. Faber and Faber published all 25 of Harris's novels. On the cover of Palace of the Peacock, we see the sacred waterfall, which is at the end of the novel on the right. And then at the left, a bunch of like trees and foliage and stuff. Yeah. So Palace of the Peacock, Harris's first novel, contains the seeds of all his future work. In it, a crew of men are embarking on a voyage up a turbulent river through the rainforests of Guyana. And it's set in 40s or 50s, around the same time Harris is doing his own work. Their domineering leader, Dunn, is the spirit of a European conquistador obsessed with hunting for the mysterious woman Mariella, his escaped ex, and exploiting African and indigenous people as plantation labor. The crew members curiously share the names of the crew that drowned during a colonial era expedition, so in the 17th century, on the same river. Similarly, the modern expedition is plagued by tragedies, haunted by these and other drowned ghosts. Ghosts like the specters of the doppelganger crew, the watching eyes from the invisible bush people, the shadowy and blurry figures at a liminal zone between life and death. Nature is depicted as a living consciousness. And so, as this living dead crew goes deeper into the interior, a kind of Heart of Darkness reference, the journey alchemically deepens into a spiritual ascendance. The living dead crew reaches the sacred waterfall, which is in fact the titular palace of the peacock, the sacred tower, and their ultimate death or second death becomes an ecstatic visionary moment. So for example, the noose which hangs the colonizer Dunn becomes the physical support that allows him to be suspended in the air and look into the waterfall, that is, into the windows of this beautiful palace of the peacock, which is all crystal and alchemical and rainbow colored and simultaneously glass, but soft and feathery. Confusing, I know, but brilliant. So now we've got some videos from the Guyanese nonprofit, the Moray House Trust, which has done a lot of wonderful work to preserve and showcase the brilliant art and literature and poetry and theater that comes out of Guyana. I'm going to play this clip and then we're going to transition into the second part of this event, which is a kind of workshop for us to reflect. We can reflect on Harris's material. We can take time to write about any experiences that we've had in nature, which involve ego death, consciousness transformation, psychedelic experiences, anything like this. In the spirit of that, I've brought some writing from high school that I did of long walks that I took in Bronx Park, which reflected on these kinds of experiences I had in Bronx Park. Okay.
I was just wondering whether, if one were to try to read the books, is there one book perhaps which, at the risk of sounding daft, is the easiest one to read? Is there one which we could, be gently introduced into this, it's like a marijuana, I don't want to go there, but
I think the Palace of the Peacock is the easiest. And we were talking about it earlier, and someone was saying how difficult Palace is, and I said, well, I think that's the easiest one, so, if you find that one difficult, beware the others. Personally, I find Palace is just majestic. I think
they do present a challenge, so maybe I could comment on reading Wilson Harris. And maybe I could answer the question asked as to which one is probably easier or which one is a good entry point. I would say Slippers of Roraima, because it is done in the way of the folk tale, and once you get a hang of it, you could move on and read. Secondly, I would like to say that reading Wilson Harris is not a task to be completed. It's not going to be finished, right? And so you read, and let us say you read the first chapter of Palace of the Peacock, don't put it down. Read that part again. So he challenges your ways of reading. So maybe you're not going to get to the end of the book by the end of the night or the end of the week, but there is some kind of motivation, understanding that comes. And maybe I'm going to go to the Bible. You read in part, understand in part, put the pieces together.
I sat here, I remember the time when I first came to Ghana in 1955. I met Wilson, and I met Martin, and we used to meet, I remember well, and there were wonderful evenings. And Martin used to read his work, and Wilson used to read his work. And Wilson was an extraordinary reader because he would pick up steam as he read his work. And I think was 1955 then. It probably was Palace of the Peacock he was reading from, or certainly some draftings for it. But I remember he used to read, and he would get more and more worked up, and his voice would get louder and louder, and he would go harder and harder. And as he began to do that, he would begin to hit Martin in the shoulder, and hit me in the hand. And then he would go and he'd say, you see, after every few sentences. And after a while, he would be flinching. And then at the end, he would say, you see? And I said, Wilson, I'm not sure I see, but I certainly feel.
One of the points he makes, and I know this from doing my own research, is this idea, the actual form of the novel itself is needed kind of completely re-articulating in the Caribbean. If you think about the idea of the form of the novel is to take a person and run them through time, run them through time and space to see what happens to them. And it is the idea of freedom that this person is able to move around in time and space. But yet the very idea of a slave runs completely counter to that. How can you have a novel with this idea of running someone through time who's a slave, who can't move around, okay? And Harris points that out. It's there in his essays. And I think his work like this is kind of undervalued. So I would encourage you. They are difficult, right? There's no question about it. But I think they're rewarding, and there are points like this that he makes that are so valuable to us. So yeah, thanks.
I'd like to add just something to what Mark was saying there. That just as he breaks the timeline in the novel, he also does away with this idea of character being clearly delineated. Now, and it's true. It's like a life spirit that flows into us and out of us and into other people. And Harris captures that. It's in Palace. You can find it right there in Palace. That I can't remember it so well, but somebody will open his mouth and another person's voice comes out. So he does away with that idea of the clear outline of personality and says that, in fact, rather than looking for a sense of individuality and who I am, we should be looking for community and who we are together.
Reading Harris to me is like listening to music. Don't stop and try to figure out what's going on in any sentence, because you will stop right there and never recover. So you read as how the water flows along a river, and somewhere or the other, some sentence, some statement, a single word will hit you, and that will take you on. We've been talking about the early novels as being a simple, easy ones to read. One of my favorites is The Far Journey of Udin, because for me it is about the East Coast. Everything you can think of about the East Coast, Far Journey of Udin. And lastly, for me, the work that sums up Harris is really his last novel, The Ghost of Memory, I think is the name of it. And that is, to me, is something totally fantastic. It is something which I have to go back and read again. And I promised myself perhaps I may be able to do 24 paintings out of that single novel.
Wow. This is Harris speaking about his own work. He says, in describing the world, you see, the language evolves and begins to encompass realities that are not visible. He attributed his innovative literary technique as developing that was the result of being a witness to the physical world, behaving as quantum theory. To accommodate his new perceptions, he said he realized that his writing was quantum fiction.
Palace of the Peacock, Harris's first and probably best known novel, takes up the recurring theme of conquest and subjection. Guyana provides the setting, as with most of his novels, and the storyline, such as it is, follows a group of men who journey into the hinterland, and that's a metaphor for the inward journey into the self. each man's construct of life is shattered, and each attains a visionary moment in which unity and harmony replace the rapaciously exploitative impulse that initially inspired their journey. By calling one of the men Don and referring constantly to his blindness, Harris seems to be reminding us of the poet John Donne's use of the eye image in his poem, The Good Morrow. As two lovers gaze in that poem, as two lovers gaze into each other's eyes, the speaker says, "My face in thine eye, thine in mine appears." But that was Don. There's no such lyricism in Harris's character, for Don's colonizing attitude denies any personhood to the other. Don describes the poverty and deprivation of his childhood, and then says this.
We belong to a short-lived family and people. It's so easy to succumb and die. It's the usual thing in this country, as you well know. He was smiling and indifferent. Our parents died early. They had a hard life, tried to fight their way out of an economic nightmare. Farmers and hand-to-mouth business folk they were. They gave up the ghost before they had well started to live. He stared at me significantly. "I look after you, son." He gave me one of his ruthless taps. Father and mother rolled into one for a while. I was a boy then. I had almost forgotten. Now I'm a man. I've learnt. He waved his hands at the savannas. To rule this. This is the ultimate. This is everlasting. One doesn't have to see deeper than that, does one? He stared at me hard as death. "Rule the land," he said, "while you still have a ghost of a chance, and you rule the world. Look at the sun." His dead eye blinded mine. "Look at the sun!" he cried in a stamping, terrible voice.
As you can see, it's all about owning and controlling for Don. Listen to how he deals with his woman.
"The woman's still sleeping," Don growled, rapping on the ground hard with his leg, again to rouse me from my inner contemplation and slumber. "What woman?" I dreamed, roused to half-waking sense of pleasure mingled with foreboding. "Damnation!" Don said in a fury, surveying a dozen cages in the yard, all open. The chickens spied us as they came, half running, half flying, pecking still at each other piteously and murderously. "Mariella!" Don shouted. Then, in still more insistent, angry voice, "Mariella!" I followed his eyes and realized he was addressing a little shack, partly hidden in a clump of trees.
Someone was emerging from the shack and out of the trees. She was barefoot, and she bent forward to feed the chickens. I saw the back of her knees and the fine, beautiful grain of her flesh. Don looked at her as at a larger and equally senseless creature whom he governed and ruled like a fowl.
Harris's aim is to explore the psyche of the Guyanese people, and indeed the psyche of colonizer and colonized wherever it occurs. He is clearly showing that that same colonizing spirit lives in Don, a Guyanese, just as surely as it did in Columbus. But he goes further. The other aspect of the psychology of empire is that the colonizer is eventually destroyed by his refusal to enter into communion with the other. In his blindness, Don comes to this vision.
Don rubbed his eyes again
wondering whether on leaving Cameron in the cave the previous day, he had lost count of the living crew as well. An idea flashed upon him, and he scanned the smooth cliff as if he followed a reflection. He saw nothing, however, and a wave of hopelessness enveloped him. Everyone in the vessel was crumbling into a door into the sun through which one perceived nothing standing, the mirror of absolute nothingness. An abstraction grew around him, nothing else. The ruling abstraction of himself, which he saw reflected nowhere. He was a ruler of men and a ruler of nothing. The sun rose into the blinding wall, and the river before him filling the stream and water with melting gold. He dipped his hands in, but nothing was there.
In Palace, the men are led through a death-like shattering of their conceptions into a life-giving vision of peace, harmony, fulfillment, and unity. Their shaman, or spiritual guide, is significantly an Amerindian woman. Here is the description of her.
We had in our midst a new member, sitting crumpled looking, like a curious ball, old and wrinkled. Her long black hair, with the faintest glimmer of silvery gray, hung in two plaits down to her waist. She sat still as a bowing statue, the stillness and the surrender of the American Indian of Guyana in reflective pose. Her small eyes winked and blinked a little. It was an emotionless face. The stiff, brooding materiality and expression of youth had vanished, and now in old age, there remained no sign of former feeling. There was almost an air of crumpled pointlessness in her expression, the air of wisdom that a millennium was past. A long, timeless journey was finished without appearing to have begun, and no show of malice, enmity, and overt desire to overcome oppression and evil mattered any longer. She belonged to a race that neither forgave nor forgot. The Arawak woman pointed, and vigilance, straining his mind from the volcanic precipice where he clung, looked and saw the blue ring of Pentecostal fire in God's eye as it wheeled around him above the dreaming memory and prison of life, until it melted where neither wound nor witch stood.
Don, of course, had previously despised the Amerindian woman. Yet, ironically, it is she who leads the crew to their epiphany.
Thanks everyone for listening to my talk and listening to those great videos from Ori House Trust and the Colin Nutley movie. For the remainder of this event, you can reflect through writing or speech or silently, however you prefer, on the themes that I discussed. Take some time to respond to Harris's work if you like. Also take some time to recall a transformative experience you may have had in nature, one which involved ego death or the sense of nature as a living presence or record of this eternal engineering collaboration between organic and inorganic conscious beings, which is, life or the universe. And when we return to come back together, we can read out loud from either our writings, our written reflections, or we can read from Harris's work, such as Palace of the Peacock. In the spirit of this reflection, I'll read from a novel I wrote in high school, largely composed while walking through Bronx Park. This work, the single most, documents my own experiences of ego death and networked consciousness in Bronx Park. It also presents a debate between a set of divine twins. One's a poet and the other is an analytic philosopher. And these two seek the single most, a kind of combination of the singularity and the neo-sublime. I didn't know it at the time since I hadn't read Harris in high school, but I was pursuing some very similar ideas. So yeah, let's take a few minutes. I'll turn it over to Isaiah in case they have any additional guidance or any commentary, and then you can maybe come back in 5 to 10 minutes, or if you need to take off, feel free to do so. Thank you for being here, and thanks for listening.
We'll come back in 5 minutes and have a little bit more conversation. That was so incredible, and I want to give everybody some time to just think and reflect. But yeah, at 7:29, we'll come back together, and I want to hear back from people, whether it's a passage from Palace of the Peacock or History, Fable, and Myth, whether it's your notes from the lecture or other work that you've been doing towards in conversation with this prompt. And we'll finish by like 7:45 after a little bit of conversation.
Hey everyone, so I think I'm gonna jump back in. Hopefully you've had some time to reflect or take a break, use the bathroom, whatever you needed. For those who are still here, um, I would love to hear any of your reflections, comments, concerns, confusions, critiques, etc. Or if you want to read from any written reflections you've got, that would be great as well. We are gonna try to stop talking by 7:45 out of respect for the interpreters and their labor. Thank you for your work, y'all. I know that's exhausting, and I appreciate you so much. Uh, I'm gonna read a couple paragraphs from the single most, like I said, uh, in the spirit of sharing some of these, I guess, transformative experiences of nature. And these experiences are from my high school, like 10th and 11th grade walks through Bronx Park. Uh, okay. And for reference, for anyone from the Bronx, I grew up on like Gun Hill and King's College Place in like the Moshalou area, Northwest Bronx. A part of Bronx Park opens some distance south of Metro North tracks. The light tinted green, rubbing leaf bellies, my feet tilting in the swampier land as I go. There are pebbles, then I walk on shoots, then the wet is in my feet, Bruck shoes, and I turn around. The end of the green maw runs almost parallel to the train tracks, always deeper, and at the far end is the brambles where men smoke and raw dog each other on the low. Farther south lies another entrance past the powder blue bridge over the cum-colored Bronx River. The bridge leads to one of the park exits, gray black gravel roads and peopled benches lining the edges of the greener land, the paths between each made by the desires of the feet. There are ribbons of dirt in the green. Severely angled, a block west of this blue bridge gropes the early light, which is like a child beneath a sheet playing at ghosts, or an eye beneath jealous lids playing at dreams, spasming weakly. And puny stores sprout upon the stretched concrete triangle, contorted, reticent, like thorns on a roseless stem. A white car parked under a tree under the sun across house hedges looks like a zebra with moving stripes. The leaves of the tree standing over it jangle and have leaves of shadow like mumbled prayers. Here's the bridge and the river that I mentioned in that paragraph. So we see the blue bridge over the Bronx River, and on the left bank are trees which are starting to yellow. On the right bank are trees which are green and starting to yellow as well, and then a truck in the far right of the image. The park is quiet, but oozes from the city's grime and waste, ingrown, a subtle revolt against urban grotesqueness. Yet its opaque green riot is sustained by exactly that which it revolts against, a clock that tells the opposite of time. I see blinking images of birds between foliage, hearing also the machine of their chirps. There are different greens, there are mud footprints that are like little mud feet. The light is like behind a Polaroid in reverse. The sun is a suspended tear behind trees, a blurry but lucid basket in the reeds, Moshe basket, no hide arc, leaves bubbling as if shaving off little sun pieces each time they bob. The morning wind subsides and what is still is yet stiller. Light is playing in my hand. The sun falls in slats. It makes a dragging. It makes experience itself heavier by light's necessity. Being human is imagining squares without corners, purity discarded. Impurity is how one may undo knots which cannot undo themselves, and weight is made known in the absence of possibility. It is the song that the gears sing while grinding. It is the Metro North hidden by this secret blush of green. The sun nearly grew a crown and skirts, disfigured chariot, treading shadow over spots of bush, nuclear. drowning in wine and becoming wax on a body, crawling mice of light like draped sheets, the scuffling sound of leaves, the glassy breeze breaking new overdue like scattered coins. Here's another image of Bronx Park. Farther in, you see a road on the right, gravel road at the bank of the Bronx River with green trees and bushes. So yeah, thanks for listening to that. If anyone else wants to read or reflect, we've got 10 more minutes. Thank you.
The floor is open. Anybody who wants to share? Somebody.
It's unmuted. Oh, it's unmuted. I'm coming over to Isaiah's Zoom, which is on the other end of the couch from mine, to just say that I was thinking about Bronx Park when you were sharing your writing, Manuel, and the way that that land is imagined to have already been like surveyed and resurveyed and reused over and over again, and how there's still so many layers of I don't know, incalculable forms of relation or something happening in it. And so it just was really nice to hear that text alongside the research that you shared on Wilson Harris. So thank you.
Yeah, actually, jumping off of that, I just realized I have one more picture here. Sorry. Just so you get a sense of like the kind of cuttiness or hiddenness of Bronx Park. This is a skyscape picture. So in the far back, we've got the Manhattan skyscape. It's kind of small and distant and under a cloudy sky. In the forefront, we see many different Bronx tenements of the Northwest Bronx. So like East 210th to like East 200th. And then at the very front, in the forefront of the image, we've got parts of Bronx Park. So you can see that it kind of just emerges randomly. It's very much like within the Bronx and less visible than a park like Van Cortlandt, which is really big and well known and visible because it's got the botanical gardens and stuff. But it's actually the same land as Bronx Park. So thank you for that.
Maybe in the name of another voice coming through you, I'll read Amal's comment from earlier as well. The surveyor quantizes the landscape, pins down its coordinates, assesses its resources. Meanwhile, the surveyor themselves is rendered dislocated, unlocatable by the land, both alive and dead. Sees the rainforest in a felled London tree, hears London shoes clicking in a Guyanese waterfall, is just maybe literally lost.
Yeah, it's like the quantum properties of the land that Wilson Harris talks about get transferred on to the person who's trying to fix them or measure them. Like they become like subject to being not able to be located or measured after they go into the interior or the forest and try to measure it so it can be exploited or extracted. Yeah, and then they end up dying multiple times, or other forms of kind of dislocation or mutually contradictory states. I thought that was like a really beautiful part of the talk also.
Did anyone make some writing in the small break, or have any writing they want to share?
I just did a very tiny. I'm from Minnesota, Minneapolis originally. So I just saw in the comment the transformative experience in nature. Nature used to be the place where I was simple, solid, whole but porous. I would sneak out my window nearly every night to walk to Minnehaha Creek and crouch on the loose bank, fall into a stupor watching the water. Or in hard winter, the bitter winter that is the best and truest thing I know how to participate in this body, I would take off my shoes and walk on the ice and rub snow on my eyes and breathe through my mouth in great gasps. I would open my mouth wide so the wind could get in. That's it.
It's really beautiful.
I wrote a thing, but my name is Adi. I'm not sure if it's as good as the last one, but I might try and read it. So 72 hours ago, I was high on acid sitting on Winnifred Beach on the northeast coast of Jamaica. I looked out at the ocean in silence for what felt like hours. The cove was flanked by a forest of mangroves, banana trees, palm trees, wild almond trees hanging onto the rock formations that were visibly crumbling, digested by the water below. The depth of the forest seemed to breathe, recede, and come forth. The masts of a large sailing boat made their appearance behind the rock to my right. It's distant, but it means. I'm not sure what. I also, while I was on acid, I was swimming in the ocean and I stepped on a sea urchin, and its little legs, hands, I'm not sure how to describe them, but they went into my foot, and I left them in there so long that they disappeared into my foot. So now I'm partially a sea urchin, I guess. That was all I wanted to say. Thank you.
What Danny wrote in the chat. You want to read it?
I didn't see it.
So I would love to hear more, but I also want to check in with the interpreters. I know we're at 7:45 now, so if y'all are tired and want to call it, you can call it.
Maybe, Danny, I see that you wrote something in the chat. Do you want to read it yourself, or have someone else read it out? I think that could be a really great way to end.
Someone else can read it. Thank you.
Isaiah, you want to read it?
Okay. An excerpt. Then we got to the end, or an end that we chose. Grace had her end and I had mine, because we reached the tip of the cliff and it would start to slope down. Grace didn't come to where I was. I stood partly on the slope, feeling still safe by the branch of a tree, as the safety bar that might secure you on a roller coaster ride. I held on to the branch. It was windy and loud because the trees are alive and talking.
That is actually a perfect way to end, though. Cool. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, everybody. I don't really have any closing words except for like huge thanks. And yeah.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Manuel. And also, Crystal wrote something really beautiful in the chat too, if people want to read it before they sign off. And thank you so much to Maria and Sarika. And sorry we ran a little bit over.
I want to find Crystal's writing.
It's a little bit further down.
Okay.
I think, right? Oh no, maybe it's further up. Oh yeah, can I read it?
Yes.
Okay, Crystal wrote, I'm in a library, but I wrote a little memory about the first time I was in the countryside as a 3-year-old city kid. And I got out of the car and it was so still and so dark and so quiet. I just froze in place for a long time, and I love that my parents relayed this memory to me. So cool. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We'll stay here and just wave goodbye.
Yeah.
Manuel, thank you so much for your work and your research. And just another reminder that Manuel is teaching another 10-week course on Sylvia Wynter, who was explained to me by Manuel as one theorist who bridges and synthesizes mythopoeticism and historical materialism really beautifully. And is also a playwright and just has such a complex body of work, and I wouldn't recommend anybody higher to lead a group of people through that work than Manuel. Really, really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for showcasing it. I'd love to have anyone who's interested in the course. It is free for Black and Indigenous folks and sliding scale for everyone else. No one's turned away for lack of funds. So definitely, if you're interested to learn more or if you want to enroll, it's like if you're already convinced, please email swinter101@gmail.com. Thanks everyone for listening and sharing your reflections. Really appreciate us coming together and humoring my fandom of this great writer and artist. Have a great night. Oh, and also thank you so much to the interpreters. I really appreciate you all.
People feel like chatting, we can leave the Zoom open.
Great. Audio is still on.
Yeah.
Jack, how are you?
Good. I just want to say I thought that was so great and it went extraordinarily well. Really glad people participated and shared their reflections at the end.
Yeah, that was so cool.
Manuel, your writing from high school is extraordinary. I want to read your book.
Thank you.
Me too.
Thanks. It is unpublished and secret for now, but it was really a joy to share some of it in this context. So thanks for bearing with me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was so good.
You can stop the recording now, right?
Yeah, shit, sorry.
Mhm.
How do I do that? I go up to the